Yep. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third meeting of the Deleuze Research Group. Today we have Arjen Kleinherenbrink from Radboud University. So I'll be the moderator of today's sessions. First, I will introduce Arjen to you. Then Arjen will take the ground and introduce the book. Then we will have a Q&A session. So Arjen Kleinherenbrink is a assistant professor in metaphysics and philosophical anthropology at the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology, and Religious Studies at Radboud University. His research is rooted in French continental philosophy, new materialism, and speculative realism. He published several books in English and Dutch. The most recent one, if the websites I was searching on was up to date, the most recent one is a book on the philosophy of Bruno Latour. Today, we will discuss Prof. Kleinherenbrink's book titled Against Continuity, Deleuze Speculative Realism, published in 2019 by Edinburgh University Press. In this book, Prof. Kleinherenbrink argues that Deleuze is above all a philosopher of discrete entities rather than a philosopher of impersonal and pre-individual processes. This claim itself is, I think, is enough to spark interest of a standard Deleuzean, because as we all, I think, it's also my opinion, we all read Deleuze as a philosopher of pre-individual singularities and intensities, but Arjen gives us a completely different picture of Deleuze, which is, I think, quite exciting, and I'm really excited to have Arjen here with us today and discuss the details of his argument and interpretation of Deleuze. So I have many questions to ask, so without further lingering, let me give the floor to Arjen. So Arjen, can you talk, first of all, before discussion, can you talk about the main motivations of the book, first of all? What do you want to achieve in this book, and what led you to write this book? How did this, I would say, very unorthodox reading of Deleuze flourish in your own intellectual adventure, and when did you decide to write the book?
Well, let me start by thanking you for the invitation and for the opportunity to discuss my, well, then probably heterodox book. And just in terms of motivation, it was very simple. I had done my master's thesis on Deleuze and capitalism, because I came from both a business school and a philosophy department in my studies. And then I got a government grant to do a PhD on Deleuze. And then at that point, my favorite, this is a bit embarrassing because he's here. My favorite piece of Deleuze scholarship were the essays on Deleuze by Daniel Smith. And there's an essay there called Deleuze and the History of Philosophy, which was one of the first pieces of secondary literature that I ever read, because my philosophy department, where I did my studies, focuses heavy on the history of philosophy. So that was a logical title to appeal to me. And there, Deleuze is quoted as considering himself a pure metaphysician and a classical philosopher. And as the first year of my PhD progressed and I was orienting myself more and more, I thought, well, that's what I want to figure out. That's the first part of the motivation. It's just the motivation to figure out what that would mean, understanding Deleuze as a pure metaphysician and a classical philosopher, which for me immediately, I mean, I'm not the only unorthodox Deleuzean, I guess, which in the sense that for me immediately dismissed scholarship that says Deleuze has no metaphysics to speak of, right? He's an anti-metaphysical thinker who's basically, if he's a metaphysician, he's at the very end of the of metaphysics. He's the one that kind of closes the door behind him, and then we all leave the party. And then the second thing in terms of motivation, or at least that was important for me in figuring out what this book was going to be like, is the well-read and well-known method of dramatization essay, where Deleuze is, I think, if I remember correctly, because this is all years ago for me as well at this point, is invited to the French Society of Philosophy. I don't know if I recall the title correctly, to give what is basically an introduction or an explanation of différence et répétition. And at that point, as with everyone who's starting to read Deleuze, there's a lot of jargon there that you completely do not understand. But what is very clear and undeniable in the method of dramatization is that Deleuze conceives of whatever he's doing there as a fourfold, where he'll say, well, reality consists of an actual half, a virtual half, and then in actuality, you have two aspects, you have parts and qualities, and in the virtual half of things, you have differential relations and singularities. So even if you don't know what any of those words mean, and at that point I had no idea, you do know that you're thinking in terms of a fourfold. And even in the Q&A to that same, but then is the transcript of that same session, Jean Waal asks one of the first questions, and the question is something like, okay, thank you for presenting to us a world conceived of as a fourfold. And then followed several months of me feeling like a madman, because sometimes, you know how in movies you have people who at some point have this kind of wall with all kinds of articles and little pieces of string and red wire between them, and they start to see connections and there's numbers and patterns. But you start to, so I started to figure out that this idea of organizing the concepts that recur in Deleuze in terms of fourfolds is not all that crazy. It happens in Proust and Science, all the way up to Mille Plateau. There is this idea of assemblages being tetravalent. And that was, I think, the basic setup for me. The basic idea was to write a book, do a study on Deleuze as a pure metaphysician, as a classical philosopher, in line with the same tradition that I was educated into, and to take him very literally, very seriously when he talks about, well, in that method dramatization essay, when he talks about a world or an ontological structure or a metaphysical baseline or whatever you want to call it, that is organized into four discrete parts.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So where did the speculative realist come to the picture?
My sister is to blame there, who is now a colleague at the university where I work, because when I was, I think, 2.5 years in, she was also doing her PhD on something entirely different, but with Patricia Pisters in Amsterdam, who's also a Deleuzian. So there's a familial but also a philosophical connection there. And at some point, she approached me. I was visiting, and she said, like, look, I know you've been working on Deleuze as a metaphysician, and I have these two books. It's from something called New Materialism and Speculative Realism. I don't know if you would be interested in it. And it was Après la finitude by Katamasu, and it was Meeting the Universe Halfway by Karen Barat. And I had never heard of any of those people. I've never heard of any of those genres. The closest I had gotten to it was that I had been reading in Difference and Givenness, Levi Bryant's, I think, dissertation or even master thesis. I never know which is which. On Deleuze.
Yeah.
Dissertation. And that opened it up for me. The idea that Deleuze ought to be ranked as a speculative realist before his time or whatever, for the simple reason that I find the concept of correlationism as introduced by Meillassoux in Après la finitude a very, very useful heuristic, a very useful measuring stick against which you can hold philosophers and say, well, you know, what's the degree to which they are idealist, without literally having to accuse them of being idealists. And I figured well, clearly anyone who takes Deleuze seriously, at least in my view, ought to agree that whatever you think about the dirty details, he's not a strong correlationist. He's a philosopher who's trying to map out, to provide a conceptual apparatus to say something meaningful about reality such as it is, not merely about reality such as we perceive it. Or at least that was my initial claim, and I would still stand by it and try to defend that.
So yeah, before leaving the ground to people, I want to ask a couple of more questions to introduce the book, like the main ideas as well. So I think the central concept or the issue of the book is the concept of individual entities. Individual entities. And
sorry, sorry, just one moment. There's people at the door, and there's, I think, a discussion developing. I'm quickly going to check what's happening. 1 minute. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Sorry, it's our new upstairs neighbors. We had the place above us is rented out.
What you call the externality thesis plays the crucial role in the book, I think. And you take this idea from Deleuze's famous claim that terms precedes relations, like terms are not reducible to their relations. And you interpret this as if Deleuze claims that individual, like you interpret the term as it stands here as entity. And I think this is the main shift in your interpretation of Deleuze. Like you interpret Deleuze's idea that terms are not reducible to their relation. Terms are the reverse. Anyway, you interpret this idea as if Deleuze proposes the existence of individual entities. So can you just explain this idea to us, and like to me at least, because it doesn't seem to me obvious, at least in the context of difference and repetition. The relations are differential relations of pre-individual genetic elements. They are not relations on empirical level. But when you use the individual entities, and given you also give many examples on the empirical realm, you understand this, you transpose this transcendental claim to empirical realm. So can you just elaborate on this main idea of the book and how you get it from Deleuze?
That's a good question. But the so let's start with the opposite claim, then, the claim that I do not defend. So if you say, well, there is a Deleuze who constantly insists, or regularly insists, on the idea that relations are external to terms, and then let's all agree that this is a motif that runs through Deleuze's entire published work, right? Starting in the study into Hume's philosophy, right up to the end, where there's still always this mention of relations of exteriority and so on and so on. Let's then say this is only true on a certain transcendental level. I think that then, I mean, we don't have time to go through all the steps, but we can see how far we get. I think then ultimately you end up with the claim made by Peter Hallward in Out of This World with a Deleuze, where everything occurs only on that transcendental level, and all of actual reality, so stones and waterfalls and microphones and automobiles and so on, as they are manifest, as they encounter each other, are not causally efficacious, where none of that stuff, or that apparent stuff, is doing any causal work, because all of the relations, all of the connections play out on that transcendental level. I think that's right. I think that if you take difference and repetition at face value, if that is the model of reality that you ultimately end up with. But I also take seriously what you find in one of the prefaces, and I think it's in either Desert Islands or Two Regimes of Madness, to the Logic of Sense, where Deleuze quite explicitly states that he's going to leave behind a big part of what he was doing in terms of the metaphysics in Différence et Répétition, because he thinks that that is a position that ultimately leans too heavily on an archaic depth, a false height, and so on. And he explicitly states, I'm going to keep using some of the same concepts, but they're going to mean different things. I'm going to tweak what I was doing. Okay, that's not what he literally says. There I'm paraphrasing in that last remark. And then what you get in the Logic of Sense, what is clearly different from difference and repetition, is this idea of bodies, and bodies that are enveloped such that they never have direct contact with each other. I mean, now, of course, that's what we all have come to associate with Graham Harman's object ontology, this idea that at their core, entities are things that withdraw from each other. But if you look in the Logic of Sense, that is what is repeatedly stated as a defining feature of bodies. Ils se retirent, they withdraw from each other in a depth, in an ontological depth. So to sum up, my answer to the question, and I think, and I still hope that I've been honest about that in the introduction to Against Continuity, is this idea that Deleuze's metaphysics develops, warps, changes its orientation after difference and repetition. I'm more interested, for contingent reasons, in that second metaphysics. And that's where I think that this idea of relations being external to terms really comes to mean an externality between entities, and not just in the sense that you described it, and that I think is completely true of difference and repetition, but that develops after that.
So maybe at this point I can open the discussion to everyone. Like, if you have any questions, you can ask at this point. Like, you can raise your hand or just unmute yourself. Or if you don't feel ready, I can continue because I have a question right now. Yeah, so let me ask.
Well, I can go ahead. So Arjen, thanks for coming and participating. It's good to see you, and appreciate all your work. Appreciate all the stuff you've done for the Deleuze Seminars project, by the way, too, letting us use your What is Grounding translation and all that. So so thanks. So just since we're on the sort of externality of relations, I just wanted to ask a question on that, because the way I've always understood that myself, just to kind of press the point, is let relations take a priority over terms. You know, that's why Deleuze is interested in the calculus. And you know, he appeals, I think it's, you know, I'm reaching back as well to an essay by Leibniz, who shows, you know, the differential relation persists even when the terms have disappeared, which is what I think he means by pure difference, like difference is a relation. And it's not just that relations are outside the terms, but actually relations have an autonomy quite apart from their terms. And that's a somewhat paradoxical position, you know, to adopt, that you can have a relation without two things being related. But, you know, he's following Leibniz there and sort of suggesting that that's how calculus works, and that's the differential relation. And this, like, a secondary question is, I've always had this question sort of with Graham Harman and the, you know, object-oriented ontology. You know, it's kind of what the motivation is, like why. And I sort of see it with Graham, because he was doing a reading of Being and Time and equipmentality, and objects withdraw into their use, and you know, he kind of develops that notion of withdrawal in the Heideggerian context. But I feel like with Deleuze, it was partly the problem was, you know, Bertrand Russell at one point said, every law of nature that we know of is expressed in differential equations. And I think Deleuze took that seriously and said, well, if you want to understand, the nature of reality that laws of nature are getting at, you need to understand the nature of differential relations. So that's partly why, he pushes that metaphysics of calculus and tries to see calculus as a kind of direct exploration of the nature of existence. And then one of the outcomes of that is, well, this is what the differential relation is. It's a relation that persists even when the terms disappear, which is slightly different than the object-oriented ontology, which is saying, well, the relations of the term between the terms doesn't matter as much as the terms themselves and the fact that they withdraw from those relations. So maybe that's I don't know, it's a question about the nature of that that fundamental thesis, the externality of relations. So I don't know, just as a way of picking up on what you were saying, I thought I'd ask that question.
That's a good question, and I always hesitate to go into the metaphysics of differential calculus, where I find myself faltering. But maybe to work towards a response, for me, what was important, or what is important, is dialogues. And in dialogues, you have a section called empiricism, where Deleuze, or we hope Deleuze, or we think Deleuze, writes, well, what's so important about empiricism? The idea that relations are external to terms. And the first two examples given there are not transcendental examples as in the previous question, but everyday example, right? Peter is smaller than Paul, and the glass is on the table, or the glass falls off the table, something like that, right? Now, why is Peter being smaller than Paul a good example of an external relation? Well, because it says nothing about the nature of Peter or Paul, that there happens to be a difference in size between them, right? If Paul suddenly dies, then nothing essential is lost about Peter. There's just some kind of relation between the two of them that is lost. I think that in a sense already warrants the claim that relations are autonomous to a degree, that they are ontologically autonomous with regards to their terms. Because if Peter is smaller than Paul, of course, Peter can also be, is at the same time, simultaneously, can stand in that same kind of relationship to many other people, animals, items, and so on. So the pure relation, the idea of X being smaller than Y, doesn't necessarily care about who or what is smaller or bigger than Y, in the same sense that let's say a job title, a job doesn't really a certain function, right? If you are the doorman to a hotel, it doesn't really matter that it's you, right? Anyone can step into that function, step into that kind of relation, step into that way of engaging with others, and it will be fine. It doesn't really matter. The relation is just there as a function, regardless of who comes to occupy it. The interesting thing about that, I think, that you get with this kind of thinking is this whole idea of what Deleuze does. What does Deleuze then mean by sorry. I haven't been speaking English a lot in the last few weeks, and now I'm tripping over myself trying to find my words and kind of simultaneously translating the Dutch that I spontaneously thinking. So step two then is that in that same section on empiricism, there's this famous idea where Deleuze says, well, if you respect this idea of relations being external to terms, then you get a logic of the and instead of a logic of the is. And to me, that is something that then completely makes sense, because as soon as you say that it's not necessarily me or I that needs to fulfill, or whatever you want to call it, that relation, that function that I now happen to stand in, then there you automatically get a proliferation of entities that could take up that kind of relation, and for the time being, for a certain period of time, be affected by that relation, being shaped, constituted by that relation, without necessarily ever essentially standing in that relation. And maybe there I'm I would, now that I'm thinking spontaneous, I think that then for me, Deleuze is closer to some of the object ontologists' concerns than you would perhaps put it.
All right. Well, thanks. Yeah, fair enough. I guess yeah. I wonder, yeah, because I think Deleuze, it's paradoxical for him to say, but then what does it mean if relations persist even when those terms disappear? You know, that there's there's difference in itself, there's a relation in itself. So, you know, you say the terms withdraw, so that's the object-oriented ontology side, that objects withdraw and they're irreducible to their relations. Is there a flip side? I mean, either for you or Graham or anyone else, the object-oriented ontology that also has to be a kind of relation-oriented ontology, because if objects withdraw totally from their relations, well, then there's an autonomy to relation. And I just, yeah, I'm wondering if that's the correlate that has to happen when relations with objects are withdrawn from relations, that means relations are also withdrawn from objects and have an autonomy, you know, of their own, because they're not reducible to those objects. And it seems to me Deleuze goes in that direction more, and maybe Triple O goes in the other direction, and maybe I'm just thinking out loud, and maybe they're, you know.
Oh, there is a weird similarity there, at the very least, between Graham Harman and Deleuze that I haven't seen anyone push. Namely that, I mean, we all know that for Deleuze, there is this idea that even a 5 o'clock in the afternoon can be something singular, right? And that would be, I think that would be a possible example of what it would then mean for Deleuze for a relation to have this kind of autonomy, right? Normally you would say, spontaneously you would say, well, 5 o'clock in the morning, that's nothing. Right, 5 o'clock in the morning. What is that? That is a certain position of the sun with regards to the Earth. It's something that is indicated on my alarm clock. It's a certain time where certain people meet. But if you take all that away, if you take away all the things that relate to each other and together constitute the fact that it's 5 o'clock in the morning, if you take all that away, then there isn't something like 5 in the morning that you have left. It just evaporates alongside with all the entities that you have now mentally abstracted from. But Deleuze doesn't do that. Deleuze says, well, 5 o'clock in the morning, for me, that's just as singular as a thing as anything else can be. Weirdly, or for me, interestingly, that's something very close to what Graham Harman also claims, namely that any relation between two entities or two or more entities is immediately in and of itself a new object. So the example that you'll find again and again in Graham's texts is not 5 o'clock in the morning, but a perception. So for him, a perception of a tree is just as much of an object as a tree and the person who does the perceiving. And if you then would subtract the person and the tree, then of course, then for him, logically speaking, ontologically speaking, you would still have that third entity, the perception. So even there may be some kind of weird parallels that have not been explored yet.
So one last thing, would that make relations, then you can just say they're a type of object on their own? That seems to be what Graham is saying in your example. You know, you have your tree, the perception, me perceiving it, but the perception itself can then be considered as an object alongside the tree and my perception of it. Would that be accurate?
I think, but he would be in a far better position to answer that than I would. But
So
I think he's ultimately committed to saying that relationality is a feature of objects, that all objects that exist have as one of their features that they function as the relators, the mediators between each other, and that there is not such a thing as objects and then another ontological category of relations in the strict sense.
Right. Okay.
At this point, I need to ask my question. So, so given that, how can we delimit an object at all? Because if everything is object or entity, all relations, all wholes and parts, like there is an entity at all. Like, how can you pinpoint something and say an entity? Because let's say my phone is an entity, but at the end it is composed of parts, and you say in the book that the parts are also entities. But like, how far would you want to push that? Because we can say, or would you say that the phone is composed of infinitely many parts, and all those infinitely many parts are entities? And also, on the bigger picture, the phone is located in a space and time, and like, let's say my phone is standing on the table. Like, what differentiates the phone from table? So they are in some way interacting with it. Like, this whole interaction is also an entity, and then the whole universe becomes an entity. So at the end, how, like, where do you put the line of delimitation between objects? Like at the end, the question becomes, what is an entity? Like, it's so basic. So how can you even delimit or discern an entity in some way on its ontological plane?
It's a very good question, and I'm going to give you a very disappointing answer. But after that, I'll explain why I can do no better than give you the disappointing answer. Namely, I think that the questions that you ask are not the metaphysician's business. But let me explain, because this sounds really blunt. First, any metaphysical position is going to run into these problems, right? If I am an analytical philosophy structural realist, and I'm Ladyman and Ross, and I say everything must go, the only thing that really exists is structure, then of course the immediate question becomes, well, then how many structures are there? And is the connection between two structures yet another structure? And how would you be able to detect those structures? And how would you know for sure that the way that you detect those structures is not contaminated by your mere thoughts and prejudices about how many structures there are and the limits of language and so on? Same thing if you say that the world is ultimately constituted or consists of substances, whichever version of substance metaphysics you would want. You get these scholastic questions of, well, how many substances are there in the room at this moment, and how would we ever find them? So that's just the preliminary remark of saying that, well, if you are a Deleuzian metaphysician who understands the world in terms of, which version you find most plausible, whether that's a version of intensive transcendental processes or heterogeneous yet continuous virtual realms or assemblages or machines, however understood, you're always going to run into the exact same kinds of questions. Namely, if you think that reality consists of entities or processes or whatever of type X, then how do you detect those? But that is not the metaphysician's job. That's the job of everything and everyone that comes after that. That's where step 2 basically happens, and metaphysics has to get tied, well, if you want to work in that order, to a methodology, right? And this is something that you, I think, clearly see in another example. If you look at Bruno Latour, for example, where actor network theory on the one hand is an ontology, or at least a way of understanding what the world ultimately consists in. But then as actor network theory gets used as a methodology in the social sciences, you get a whole new range of questions about, well, how then to map actors, how to figure out how many there are, how to shift the way in which you detect actors depending on the situation. Because if you work in a laboratory where some new kind of medicine is developed, and you're dealing with different actors than when you're studying social objects or mythology or distant galaxies, right? So the questions you ask are good questions, but I don't think that they, strictly speaking, pertain to the pure business of doing metaphysics.
thank you. Like, I have a follow-up, but let me see.
Oh, and can I have a follow-up? Can I have a follow-up answer? Sorry. It also hinges on what you. I think the questions also have to do with what you think the relation between metaphysics and epistemology is, right? Because of course you would have many. There are more than enough theories who start with the kinds of questions that you ask, and by in some way arguing that you cannot inquire into the nature of reality without also from the get-go inquiring into our kinds of access to that very reality, right? Into the nature of our cognition and into the ways in which we might discern, let's say, truthful or truth-apt thoughts about the nature of reality with misleading or simply completely wrong thoughts about the nature of reality. And if you are convinced by the idea that ontological questions and epistemological questions are, in a sense, two sides of the same coin, that they are inseparable, then you're completely right. And then you cannot do metaphysics in the way that I try to do it, and that I think Deleuze is doing it, because then you would have to always already include the kinds of questions that you ask.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So David Mullins is going to ask a question, I think.
Oh, hey, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah. Oh, so I was really interested in the and I know you you are too in your book, that just the status of, I was hoping if you could say a little bit about the status of the technical machine distinction versus other machines, if that's not too broad, or what, because you talk about how there's this, well, it's not a strong opposition, it's not a strict opposition, not rigorous opposition, it's a difference of regime. But I was just wondering, is there, I was in the context that I've engaged with it, particularly in the Kafka book, I'm quite I'm not sure what a simple technical machine is, or even what a technical machine is. And so I'm curious as if there was anything you might be able to say about that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. In the book, I argue that technical machines and social machines are not, as Deleuze writes about them, are not meant as two different kinds of machines, two vastly different kinds of entities, but rather two ways of functioning that can occur, that two ways of functioning that can be true of any machine whatsoever in principle, right? There are two kinds of relations that machines can have with each other, and that can change over the course of a lifetime. So I think that distinction is part of a wider vocabulary that would help you, let's say, trace or name what a certain machine is doing in a certain respect. In the same way, with simple examples, in the same way that you can be a part of something, while at the same time other things can be part of you, right? You can be shaped by a language, while at the same time shaping that language.
Yeah,
Does that kind of help?
Yeah, I get, maybe it'll help if I explain sort of the stakes. I'm sort of a vague question in
Yeah,
a certain
sure.
sort of way. Yeah, sort of the stakes of it, of just the, I kind of feel a very I almost smell a sort of I want to say a Heideggerian reading of technology, and a sort, or just a sense of a very, it feels like Deleuze and Guattari are very low on tools in a certain way, or it seems like at every moment it's a exclude the tool from something. And of course they'll say, no. It's not a real, it's not a rigorous distinction, it switches and stuff, but it at least is not totally a stabilized argument. It changes in Kafka-minded literature from the other stuff. I think that's probably where it's the most like, Kafka doesn't care about technical machines at all. They've got nothing to do with his work. He's all about the social. But then I think in 1,000 Plateaus and AO, they're a little more careful. But I don't know. It feels like a weird situation to me, and I'm not sure. I'm not satisfied by what they say about it necessarily. And I'm just curious if you had any of this, we're smelling any of the same things, or that's just me.
Well, I don't, well, because in the Kafka book, for example, Deleuze, and I mean, you already had most of the paraphrase there, right? They say, well, Kafka had no admiration for technical machines,
Yeah.
but he had this kind of interest. He knew very well that technical machines were parts of wider aggregates. Yeah, but by parts of wider aggregates of what? And I think there they named like more machines, more personnel, and so on, right? So the only being low on tools, as you put it, that you could draw from there is that Deleuze and Guattari are not overly fond of viewing a tool in isolation, right? For example, of asking, and then you could say, for example, of asking, what are smartphones doing to our children? You could make an argument that for the kinds of thinkers that Deleuze and Guattari are, who try to think in terms of these larger assemblages of entire landscapes that shape people, it would be probably more useful to not just take into account what the smartphones are turning our children into, but to try to position that in the wider landscape of technology, diet, language, and so on, that all features into how children grow up and what they come into contact with.
Yeah, I just like, but don't they have their private singularities thing just in principle too? Like, yeah, I don't want to talk about smartphones in isolation either, but just like, just seems like in principle you shouldn't have like a pure, empty, totally without private internal thing, like based on the right, and sort of based on the argument that I think you draw out really just very persuasively as a fundamental argument of Deleuze, of just this externality, the insistence of this argument that things being sort of their relations, etc. They all have a secret singularity thing. Why don't smartphones too? Don't they have to too? Right? It just seems like that's kind of my reaction. In principle, it seems like.
Sure. So,
Okay.
but this maybe but and then also to tie to some of the earlier remarks that we've had so far. I think that the way that Deleuze and Guattari write about technology also helps you prevent the idea that some technology, amongst others, has by definition a bigger part to play in, let's say, human existence than others, right? So there is a way in which you could say, well, language is a technology or a techne, right? And you could have this idea that language is the house of being, to stay in that kind of terminology, and then start thinking that, okay, amongst all the technologies that we have, ranging from the material to the immaterial, it will always be language that has the biggest part to play in determining what we are, what we do, who we become, and so on. That is, in a sense, you would then say there's this kind of internal relation between language and the human beings that think and speak it, in the light sense of language has a more essential, more vital, more significant role to play than any kind of other technology. And I think that the way that Deleuze and Guattari talk about technologies wards off that kind of a priori privileging what is most important in an assemblage. Because what is most important in an assemblage, even if something is the most important thing and it stays the most important thing for centuries on end, that is still, I think, within a Deleuzian worldview, within a Deleuzian theoretical frame, a contingent state of affairs that must be produced, reproduced, maintained by other entities, and that can therefore, in principle, be altered, such that there can be situations in which language is not the most important thing that determines the course of a human existence, and so on.
Yeah, no, that's compelling to me. That's compelling to me for sure.
Brian?
Yeah, well, first off, I just want to say thank you. I unfortunately haven't given the book the deep reading it deserves, so my question is almost surely addressed somewhere in the book. But I think what I appreciate the most is I think this idea of Deleuze as the pure metaphysician is something that I've been very committed to as well. So I really appreciated your sort of not critiques. Critique seems a bit strong, but your sort of, criticisms of, the scholarship in general for trying to avoid metaphysics in a certain sense. But there is a part of me, because so much of this book I found so persuasive that the parts that I have read in depth, but on page 31, there's this quote. There's this mainstream image of Deleuze as a philosopher who sees reality as a swirling ocean of flows, events, intensities, and processes. I just still can't see myself leaving that camp. Like that just describes me to a T. Because there's certain things, and I'll bring up the later Leibniz book, The Baroque and the Fold, where there's the chapter on the event. Everything is event. The object is an event. The object is no longer an object, and he makes the joke that now it's the objectile. I'm not sure like how to. Well, as I was reading the book, there were so many wonderful moments where I was being very convinced by a lot. But there's certain moments in Deleuze, and specifically later Deleuze or throughout Deleuze, that there's these moments that just seem to rub against your thesis in general. That I'm not sure how to. I mean, I feel like it's due to a misunderstanding of something that you're saying. So that's why I'm asking the question, because I'm like, I know there's probably a good answer here. But even just this idea of reducing things to these discrete entities being the machine. I mean, the machines, though, they're disrupting a flow, they're diverting a flow. So it seems like the flow is still more fundamental in some way, and that the machine is sort of a machination, to use a slightly different translation, of which, how do we organize the flow? How do we screen the flow in a certain way? So, yeah, I think that's my question. I'm not sure if you have any comments on that.
Thank you for the question, Brian. But if you will allow me, I'll answer in a bit more general sense, because otherwise I'll get tempted to no. But so the one problem here is that at some point it becomes, let's say, misleading to say, well, you have, and not just with Deleuze, but also with other positions, you have process philosophy on the one hand, and then you have substance philosophy on the other hand. You have philosophies who think that everything is a swirl, a becoming, a happening, a development, a differentiation, you name it. But on the other hand, you have, traditional, maybe backwards philosophy first, who think that there are just plain boring old things. But here comes the rub. Here is the rub. Sorry if I make a lot of mistakes. Here's the rub. If you think that in this camp, where there, with the whatever theories think that there are just plain boring old things, if you think that there are no a priori properties, and also no properties that a thing just has by virtue of it existing, but that all things only have properties insofar as they are produced and reproduced, maybe altered and destroyed, in their engagement with other things, then the whole opposition between process philosophy and substance philosophy, in a very qualified sense, collapses. Because now you have, and I think Deleuze falls in that category, now you have a philosophy where, now you have a theory according to which there are discrete entities, where there is a clear distinction between this and that, but there are no properties, two entities that can exist without at least some relations between entities being responsible for generating those very properties. And that's where I guess the kind of question that you ask, or the kind of intervention that you make, comes from. Because I think that as soon as that gets introduced to the picture, it becomes much more difficult to say what then distinguishes the one quasi-process philosopher from the other quasi-process philosopher, because now we're all of a sudden in a situation where all parties agree to the idea that, properties, features of entities don't just fall from the sky, they have to be actively produced and reproduced in some kind of flow, right? So in the book, I ultimately try to argue that for Deleuze, if there is an in itself of an assemblage, a machine, an entity, it should be understood as its affects, its powers, that which it can do, and that which it can do to others, that which it is receptive to. Well, if you take a very quotidian example of what a power to be, for example, my power to speak English, to some extent. Of course, that power exists only to the degree that certain biological wetware, texts that I read, memories that I have, conversations that I have actively produce and reproduce that power. So is there a process going on? Yes, there definitely is a constant flow of, let's say, reinforcement or reproduction going on, because how else would a power to speak a certain language exist? How else would you conceive of that? But at the same time, I think Deleuze is the kind of philosopher that has the conceptual tools to help us understand that such a power should not be identified with the entities that generate it. Right? That there's a difference there, that there is an irreducibility there, that even though my power to do something is completely dependent and waxes and wanes in terms of its reach and scope and intensity by virtue of many entities around me, even though that is the case, that power is still very much my power, and you cannot say that the one is completely identical to the other, because that would be to make a category mistake. I hope that helps at the very least clarify where I stand on this. But I'm not sure that's where you would want to go with the question.
No, thank you. That was a great answer. Yeah, it's a lot of food for thought. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to giving this book the read it deserves over my break, because I think it's fantastic.
Thank you,
James.
Yeah, so I had a couple questions. So the externality thesis, you draw a conclusion, the first page of your externality thesis chapter, where you say, if relations are external to terms, entities must therefore have a private internal reality. So two questions about that. Why do you think that if we adhere to this idea that relations are external to terms, that leaves anything like an internal reality to the terms? That doesn't seem to follow from positing relations as external, because how I read the externality thesis from Deleuze before encountering your book was that it takes away the interiority of the terms, because the interiority of the terms was like, okay, we have a book, and the interiority of the book is its relation to the idea of a book. It's its predicates, its various relations to concepts and ideas. And so by making the relation of the book external to it, you then take away any sort of internal reality to the term, book, right? So that was one thing. The other thing is the same paragraph where he introduces the externality thesis in dialogues that you mentioned. He continues and says, in effect, if relations are external and irreducible to their terms, then the difference cannot be between the sensible and the intelligible, between experience and thought, or between sensations and ideas, but only between two sorts of ideas or two sorts of experiences, that of terms and that of relations. So the other concern I had is that you assume that when the relations become external to terms, terms are actually entities. But it seems that when Deleuze is actually bringing up the externality thesis, terms are just another kind of idea. And he's not actually talking about entities, but simply a division between two different kinds of ideas within like a Humean idealism or phenomenology. So I was wondering why you read the externality thesis as applying to entities and relations instead of simply ideas of terms and ideas of relations, and then why you think when terms become relations become external to terms, why would then terms still have a kind of interiority to them?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, and I think you're like, I'm embarrassed now because you quoted me saying it, but I no longer agree with me putting it that strongly, because of course there is no reason to say relations are external to terms and then it automatically follows that that entities therefore have a private interiority. More information is needed. I'm not saying that is not in the book. I hope enough is in the book, but that statement there, as bold as it is there, no, because that's precisely the Humean imposition, where you say, well, there's this, what the analytical philosophers nowadays call a Humean mosaic of particular matters of fact, and whatever relations there are between those are just observations that we make, or things that we happen to register in some shape, form, or fashion, but that does precisely not have to have anything to do with the interior nature or whatever, or the necessary connections between those entities. So there, I would say point granted. But I think, nevertheless, that Deleuze is still somebody who interprets this idea of relations being internal to terms as leading to more than its strict first formulation leads to, right? Because you are right in the quote that you gave, but I quickly pulled up dialogues as well, and the full sentence runs. One can clearly see how the pseudo first principle of empiricism derives from this, but as a negative limit always being pushed back, and so on and so on. So there is an argument to be made there that this is not the only thing that Deleuze wants to say about empiricism, and that there is more to be added to it. And I think there, if you look at, for example, Lettres et autres textes, where Deleuze gives some examples to that, they're very, very everyday examples. If I have this stack with, I think if he talks about a stack of cubes, blocks, right? If you move a block from the stack, then you rupture some of its relations, right? It's no longer to the left of this, it's no longer to the right of that, it's no longer on the top of this or that, but it's still the same block if you remove it. And if you then apply that same idea to all actual and possible relations that this block stands in, that this little Lego has with its environment and even with its own parts, you realize that there must be more to this entity than just the relations that it stands in, even if those relations are necessary to generate whatever that more is, right? For the simple reason, for the complex reason that, and I think I quote that in the book, that if things would be nothing else than their relational, whatever you want to call it, web, structure, assemblage, and so on, then nothing could change. The universe would be frozen, becoming would have already become, right? These are formulations that you sometimes find when Deleuze talks about this. He talks about this at some length in his Nietzsche book. The universe would have already become, everything would have been frozen. Why? Because if everything is nothing but the relations in which it stands, then change is impossible, right? If this little Lego block is nothing else than the relations it entertains with its parts and environment, or even just with a subset of its parts, and the same is true for every other possible entity, then it becomes very hard to conceive of how it would be possible that anything in the world changes. This is ultimately, it goes back to Aristotle and the Megarians, right? The idea where the Megarian school, whoever they were, argues that when a house builder is not building a house, he doesn't have the property of being a potential house builder, which seems to suggest that the Megarians thought that if you are a house builder from Monday until Friday, but on the weekends you don't work, you are not a house builder on the weekends. What are you on the weekends then? Well, you are whatever you are engaged with then, right? You are all your weekend relations, but nothing besides. There's no potential house builder lurking in the ontological depths of your soul or whatever, just waiting to pop out on Monday. To which Aristotle, and I think correctly replies, well, how would anyone then ever be able to start building a house, right? There must be some kind of surplus that in whatever it is that defines an entity that allows it to do a little bit more at the very least, and in fact do indefinitely many more things than it is currently doing in order for change to be possible. Incidentally, I think that well, obviously, I'm biased because I'm very sympathetic to my own interpretation. But here I think that Deleuze is really onto something by defining things in terms of their affects, in terms when he does that, like because when you're defining something or someone in terms of their capacities, right, their tendencies, their powers, their puissance, but let's say capacities to affect and be affected, then you already have everything you want, right? So let's go back to the example of my capacity to speak English. Do I need to have all kinds of relations with things that regenerate that capacity in me? Yes, otherwise it would not exist. But as soon as I have this capacity, then that capacity, in a sense, transcends and is irreducible to, up to a point, to the set of features that generates it, right? My capacity to speak English is not the textbooks, the songs, the neurons, the synapses, and so on, that make for that capacity all summed up. There's a difference there. At the same time, my capacity to speak English can be manifested, can be made actual in indefinitely many more ways than the conversation. Well, it's almost turning to a monologue at this point, so I apologize to that we're having right now, right? I'm capable of doing many more things with my capacity to speak English, including not manifesting it, than I am currently doing. So there you have this idea of what ontologically, this excess, this surplus, this more than being just your relations, a thing could be, namely its powers, while at the same time fully respecting that there should not be in your ontology anything that just magically pops up out of thin air, and instead everything should be really produced, reproduced, generated in this very world by the entities that surround it.
Mhm. So
Does that kind of help?
yeah, so I guess then my question would be, why do you think that this excess surplus of potentiality exists within discrete entities? Because for Deleuze, it clearly seems that this excess exists in the form of ideas that are transpersonal, that are, you know, problematic in ways that they don't fit within the form of discrete entities, but they are, you know, they aren't individuated that way.
Well, that depends on
the
the
potentialities
way
of a language, right? So the language we speak, the potentialities of it aren't contained in me per se. They're contained within the idea of language, and that's not something that is a potentiality that is contained within me as a discrete entity. That's something that is contained at an ideal level, perhaps. So I'm just not sure why the potentialities have to always be possessed by a certain discrete actual object.
Well, there, I think that I'm very sympathetic to what Manuel de Landa often points out as one of the, let's say, strong points, one of the advantages of thinking in terms of assemblages, namely that assemblages can be, is it proper English to say nested in each other?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So it's completely possible for you to be, let's say, nested within a language, or it's completely possible for you to be nested in a local dialect that is nested in a language that is nested in yet another set of assemblages, and so on, with all those assemblages having their own properties, having their own features, and all those assemblages functioning as generators, as organizers, as, let's say, resources for each other, right? So I think that the nice thing about the way in which Deleuze and Guattari think is that you don't have to locate all, let's say, immaterial properties in the heads of people, right? Because I think they are realists about, at the very least, the causal efficacy, but I think they go the whole hog. They are realists about there being social objects, about languages, organizations, governments, armies, and so on, having their own workings, having their own natures, being just as real as any physical object that you might encounter. And that's kind of, I would say, gets you out of the trouble of having to think like, am I then the carrier of everything that my language can do? No, your language is the carrier of the language is the carrier of everything that the language can do. But then there are particular human beings that are taught that language and thus acquire their own set of powers, capacities, and so on in terms of them being able to use that language to certain ends.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, good.
Right.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. I quite enjoyed your book, the parts that I read. So, like what I'm about to ask, maybe you've addressed this. And it's really about a brief comment that you make in chapter 1. Like, am I audible, by the way?
Yes, perfect.
Brief comment that you make in chapter 1. It might be peripheral to your larger project, where you say that like Deleuze rigorously respects human finitude. essentially. Like his ontology is not one of infinite understanding or absolute knowledge. Instead, it rigorously respects human finitude. And I was wondering what you mean by human finitude here. In like just a few lines previous to that, you say that like this is like Deleuze never posits a constitutive subject, or it's not like objects are fully present to subjects. So by finitude, you don't mean like the finitude of a subject as we understand it in a classic like Kantian sense, or like the finitude of Dasein as we understand it with Heidegger. So like I'm just like wondering what you really meant by finitude. I don't even know if this might be peripheral to your larger project, but like yeah.
No, it's not. So thank you for the question. It's not peripheral to my larger project, because I am. So I read Deleuze as somebody who doesn't think that you can literally name the being in itself of other entities, right? In the sense that Deleuze's metaphysics doesn't give you an ultimate list of what there is. In the sense that you could have other metaphysicians who say, well, God exists, or metaphysicians who say, well, subatomic particles are the only thing that exists, and everything else is a perceptual illusion. Or eliminativists, if you talk about more regional metaphysics, right, special metaphysics, who say, well, all of your thoughts, all of your emotions, all of your ideas are just, a mirage, because the only thing that ultimately exists is the brain and interaction between the parts of the brain that somehow makes it seem like there are these things like thinking and feeling, but really that's not even something that exists. Right? So there are philosophers who will tell you, I have a theory that can help you sort out what exists and what doesn't, can help you sort out, on the one hand, in one big pile, the really causally efficacious things in reality, and on the other hand, all the things that seem to be causally efficacious, but really aren't, because they're just perceptual illusions or superstitions and so on. Deleuze doesn't give you that. And here I think that I'm pretty safe, because no interpretation of Deleuze's metaphysics gives you that. Right? Deleuze's metaphysics is the kind of theory that tells you ultimately how the world or reality or things are ontologically structured, right? So if you say everything is a machine, or if you say, well, there's this virtual realm, or whichever interpretation you prefer, you say something about, if an entity really exists, then what is its ontological structure? But Deleuze's philosophy, strictly speaking, doesn't help you separate the wheat from the chaff in the way that other philosophers claim their theories are able to do. Does that help?
Right, yeah. Yeah, I think so. Like I'm thinking a bit about the repercussions, and I'll probably get back on that if I think more about it. But yeah.
So does anyone have any other questions? We have 15 more minutes. If no one has question, I have one more. Maybe, yeah, Ben, please.
Yeah, so that's great what you just said. I just want to follow up on that and also make it personal. I'm kind of interested in your trajectory that you've done this book on the tour. Is it going to be translated at any point, do you know, or just out of curiosity, or?
I would love that, but I haven't pursued it at this point.
Nothing in well, that's too bad, because I'd love to read it. But no, I just like what you said about metaphysics, and because I've always taken that line by Deleuze that he's a pure metaphysician as somewhat tongue-in-cheek, because it was against Heidegger, Derrida. Everyone was talking about the overcoming of metaphysics, and I think he wants to say, well, I'm not part of that crowd. But at the same time, he sort of does have an answer to what the nature of reality is, if that's what metaphysics gives us. And it's, in a way, it's one word, but he says, yeah, being it's a problem, which is a way of saying, as you're saying, we don't know what being is. It has a problematic structure, and that's the nature of metaphysics. So it's also somewhat tongue-in-cheek. And then that accounts for the fact that you were pointing out, like, his concepts change even within his own work, because in Difference in Repetition, he's interested in depth, but then it's surface and logic of sense. And then in Anti-Oedipus, he uses the word intensity and all of those, but it's a different concept in each book, because he's he's really developing a different problem in an anti-Oedipus. Intensities are what happen on a body without organs, not what happen in depth, and so on. So, you know, it's a complicated question, metaphysics. I'm just sort of curious about you personally. Do you see yourself as a metaphysician, not a Heideggerian or Derridian overcoming metaphysician? And if so, how you, you know, how you see that yourself, and, you know, your own trajectory going from Against Continuity to, I guess it was last year, the tour book, and maybe a word about where you see yourself going in the future is, yeah. Do you see yourself as a metaphysician, and that's part of the nature of your project?
Thanks for the question. Yes, I see myself as a metaphysician. That's fortunate because that's also what my university pays me for. So if I stop being a metaphysician, I'm in deep trouble. But also because I cling to this naive, but maybe also optimistic, but to this naive idea that is ultimately what differs. What makes the difference between philosophy and something like opinion, right? Because and then but let's start then with what is metaphysics, and there I agree with A.W. Moore and the introduction to his wonderful overview book, The Evolution of Modern Metaphysics, where he says something like, I'll paraphrase, what is metaphysics? Metaphysics is trying to get the broadest possible understanding of whatever there is in the broadest possible sense. Like, he has this very, very open idea of what a project of metaphysics is. What then is the difference that this makes? Well, the difference that it makes is that if my neighbor says, well, what's really remarkable about life is that at some point we're all born somewhere, and then you have to just deal with the hand that you're dealt. What's the difference between my neighbor who says that in a kind of inebriated moment where they gaze at the stars and reflect on human existence, and Heidegger and Frohness or Hannah Arendt and natality? Well, the difference is that in philosophy, you try to root your observations about what the political is, or what ethics is, or whatever subdiscipline you are in, whatever subdiscipline you are in the most fundamental grounds that you can find for whatever claim you're making, right? I think that is the difference maker between philosophy and opinion, is that as a philosopher, you're trying to say, well, I have this theory, and it's not just an opinion because I can tell you a meaningful story, I can give you a meaningful argument as to how that theory fits within the broadest possible conceptual framework that we ought to have for, well, in total, the world or reality, but per subdiscipline, it would be more like special metaphysics, right? The metaphysics of the mind, or the metaphysics of social objects, or what have you, right? So, for example, let's have another example, because I used to be in business school before I became a philosopher, and in business school there's one ethical debate that prevails above all others, and that is the bad barrels or bad apples debate, right? Do you get corrupt banks because banks corrupt people, or do you get corrupt banks because corrupt people corrupt banks, right? Is it the apples or the barrels that make for the corruption? What use would it be if you go into a journal on leadership and ethics in businesses, and you enter that debate as a philosopher? What could you possibly add to that the organization theorists haven't figured out amongst themselves in the last few decades? Well, that would be some kind of theory that says something about bad apples and bad barrels, and makes some kind of argument as to, here is what we should probably think about this, because I can situate the arguments that I'm giving you in a much wider perspective than you are usually, giving yourselves and others. I think that kind of zooming out and seeing how a certain theory, how a certain idea fits in our best, whatever that may mean, ideas about what reality or a chunk of reality is. I think that's the difference that you try to make as a philosopher. And that's why I try to be a metaphysician, even when I'm not directly writing about metaphysics.
All right, cool, great, thanks.
And that's also, I think, sorry, to add to that, that's also my interest in, part of my interest in Bruno Latour is that actor network theory is not just a methodology that a social scientist can use to describe a controversy or to create a report on a certain state of affairs in the world. It's also a theory about how the world ultimately consists of actors and not of substances or phenomena or subatomic strings or what have you, right? That's why that's the kind of theory that you ought to take seriously from a philosophical perspective. It's also what makes it more than just one method, one competing method amongst others. Sorry, I wanted to just add that as an addendum.
So Latour is a kind of metaphysician in his own right, I guess. In a way.
Yes, but he cheats. So
He cheats.
yeah, no, but he cheats in interviews because if he's asked, it's very clear. If he's asked,
Yeah.
"Are you a philosopher?" He'll say, "I'm an anthropologist." And if you say, "Are you just a sociologist?" He'll say, "No, no, no. I'm really also engaged with metaphysics." And then sometimes he says actor network theory should have been called actant rhizome theory, but then he's not a Deleuzian. But then at other times he said Deleuze is the most important philosopher that France ever produced. So he was hard to pin down.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, Ahmed, go ahead.
Yeah, does anyone have any other questions? Maybe we can close here because I think it's a great place to close, like about your future. We talked about your future projects, like the way your studies go. So maybe we can close here if no one has any other questions.
By talking about the future, it won't be the Latour book, but there's a Dutch book that I wrote with a good friend of mine on adventures. And that will be translated into English and it will be published early 2025 if we have everything done in time, because there is as of yet no systematic philosophical study of the notion of adventure, and we're trying to get ours. Well, we're going to get ours translated into English.
Oh,
It's
fantastic.
exciting, yeah.
Yeah. Is that related at all to like Whitehead? Because he at least had a title. Adventures of
The
Ideas.
Adventure of Ideas. Yeah. It's one of the it's very interesting because in Whitehead, in Sartre, in Simmel, and many others, and even more even in Hegel, you find these kind of reflections every now and then on adventures, on ridderromans, the knightly chivalric novels, and so on. But there are no systematic studies, no book-length reflections on the logic of adventures and investigations of why adventures are the most popular form of stories that we tell each other. But more to come.
Wow, fantastic. Yeah.
Sounds really
Look forward to
interesting.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks everyone for coming today, and Arjan, thanks a lot for accepting my invitation and like being here, having that was a great discussion. I think I enjoyed a lot and learned a lot, lots of provoking ideas and interpretations. Like I will send an email to you about for my other questions. It was really great. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Arjan.
thanks, Arjen. Appreciate it.
Daniel, do you maybe have 2 or 3 more minutes?
Sure.
Because I have a proposal.
Okay.
But Ahmed, thank you very much for organizing this.
Yeah,
It was
sure.
great.
Let me then. I am making you host, so let me leave you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Just a moment. Yeah. Yeah, you must be the
You are host now. Yeah, it says it on my
Okay.
screen.
See you, everyone.
All right,
Bye-bye.
thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ahmed, for arranging all
bye.
this.
Can I remove people who are not?
Then you can remove. Like, let me make you I am not no more host.
Okay.
So then you can remove people. Yeah.